afternoon to many of you. And of course, good morning to our distinguished guest, Dr. Gieseking. My name is Bracke, and I hold the chair in Sociology of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm the director of the Amsterdam Research Center for Gender and Sexuality, RGS, together with Julie McBrien, who is the vice director. And we are pleased to welcome you all today for a session in our webinar series called Focus on Research, which really puts the spotlight on new research on gender and sexuality. And I will introduce our guests, speaker and respondents in a moment. But let me just first mention or repeat that this webinar is recorded so that everybody is aware, and also that it will be made available on the website of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, the ASSR, soon after this event. And so before I go on to introduce what we will do today, let me just say a few words about RGS. Our research center seeks to foster and consolidate a community of scholars and scholarship on gender and/or sexuality within the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. Now, this is a community shaped by many differences in disciplinary contexts and traditions, different theoretical and epistemological approaches, different methodologies, and also differences in the emphasis on gender or sexuality within one's research. And we are committed to make this an expansive community where such differences are welcomed and provide fertile ground for conversation and for new ways of thinking. Check our websites for the events that we organize and also our PhD community. So for the PhD students among you, check our website and stay in touch. For the PhD students can join our PhD club, for instance. So for today, not so long ago, we actually gathered in a room for these kind of events, and Dr. Gieseking was indeed scheduled to be with us physically last May. Like everybody else, we had to rethink the ways in which we create intellectual community and a research community. And so this academic year, we have two webinar series. One is called Thinking Through the Crises, where we have speakers who engage with urgent questions or crises of our times, such as Professor Bhattacharya in our opening event this year, The Crisis of Reproductive Work. And we consider these crises from the angle of gender and sexuality. Now, our second webinar series is called Focus on Research, and that is what we're doing today, where we put the spotlight on new, exciting research into gender and sexuality. Now, let me also just add that the distinction between these two series might be arbitrary at times. New research, like the one we focus on today, often tackles crucial questions and crises of our times, or vice versa. But our series of today really allows us to focus or to zoom in, oh no, I don't like that word anymore. Okay, to focus on a new book on new research that is just out. And today that is the book A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes and Queers, that came out, I was told precisely this day, 2 months ago in September with New York University Press by Dr. Jack Gieseking. Now, Dr. Gieseking is assistant professor of geography at the University of Kentucky, where he teaches courses on digital, feminist, and queer geographies and critical cartography and mapping. And A Queer New York is his first book, a historical geography of contemporary lesbian-queer society and economies in New York City. The book relies on mixed ethnographic archival approach, and I'm sure we're going to hear much more about that, which has resulted in rethinking the construction of data and also in the production of LGBTQ data visualizations about queer history. Dr. Gieseking is managing editor of the International Journal for Critical Geography, as well as a board member of the Rainbow Heritage Network. We also have two scholars with us, more or less from within the orbit of RGS, although I'm not entirely sure if I can say that about Dr. Andrew Shields, although I am hoping that an event like this might also be a way of collaborating more. Dr. Andrew Shields, who is Assistant Professor of Migration History at Leiden University and is the chair of the Leiden LGBTQ plus network. And Dr. Ladan Rahbari, newly appointed Assistant Professor of Migration and Digital Sociology at our sociology department. So these two wonderful colleagues have agreed to engage with a Queer New York. And we will proceed in the following way. Dr. Gieseking will first present his book for about more or less 20 minutes. And then Dr. Shields and Dr. Rahbari will each offer their responses, their insights, each 5 to 10 minutes. And that will flow into conversation and discussion between our guests. And then at some point, organically, I will open the floor for Q&A from all our participants. And we will close this gathering latest by 5 p.m. When the Q&A starts, so there is an opportunity to ask questions, there should be a Q&A button on your screen where you can type your question. That will be the easiest way also for the order of the questions, but I will come back to the logistics of Q&A when we get there. That's pretty much all from me for today. It's with great pleasure that I give the floor to Dr. Gieseking. And yeah, welcome, and we're very happy to have you with us. Thank you. Okay, I think your mic, you are unmuted.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Andrew and Ladan, for being here. I'm really honored to be in conversation with all of you. And I want to thank Robbie and Diego, Robbie Davidson and Diego as well for organizing all of this. I'm really honored to be here. I was also so disappointed to not be here in May. Yeah, so thank you for considering to have me again. And it's an honor to talk to you about my book, which, yes, just came out. Feel free to tweet during this should you want to, no pressure. Yeah, I'll jump into A Queer New York. That's the book cover over there, and here's the book. So the question and the idea of what is a LGBTQ production of space was something that really interested me, kind of coming from the social production of social space from a Lefebvre, or, you know, it's very similar David Harvey kind of idea. And often, I'll get to that image in 1 second, but often when I talk to people, I ask them, you know, where would you find a gay space? And they'll definitely have this very urban fixation. They'll talk about neighborhoods and bars. And I thought that this was a very obviously limited viewpoint. And you can trace it back in the literature in part to something like this image on the left from Manuel Castells, very well-known prominent sociologist who decided in his really important book in the early 80s to include the gay and lesbian movement as a social movement of study. He made a map of gay voting patterns, people who had voted for the first out candidate, elected candidate in US history, Harvey Milk, and this is San Francisco that you see. And Castells was just absolutely shocked to find out that gay people live together. Could you believe it? That was amazing to him. He thought that they had a similar culture, politic, and economy. And altogether, he said, this is a unique way of producing space. And have you seen what they've done to the real estate? They've really contributed to society. And Castells was setting up a very long-term notion of the work of gay gentrification, which Larry Knopp would later dub. And it's a really racialized ethnic enclave model whereby people would pull themselves up by their bootstraps and heel straps and claim long-term property ownership in the city. And this was framed as LGBTQ liberation. Jen Harrowtorn, really utterly brilliant sociologist and queer of color theorist, responded to Castells years later in their Queer Others and Hateful Others book with this fantastic quote that I want to read you, that the claim of a gay neighborhood as its own territory presents a non-intersectional landscape where gays, white, exist alongside other racialized populations who are assumed straight, who are excessive to the newly forming gay community. And this was something that stood out to me very early on as well. And this assumption that one would be legitimated, accepted, if not tolerated, and gain rights by long-term property ownership. At the same time, Castells said, I didn't really talk to any lesbians. They seemed to hang out in networks. They like potlucks. I didn't know where to find them. And he left it at that. Since then, and even before then, people who've studied lesbian spaces specifically have never used the word neighborhood, something they've done with a lot of nervousness. They've called them concentration or spatialized communities. At the same time, I was really thinking about LGBTQ, women's and trans and gender nonconforming people's production of space, especially at that time, women's production of space. And that literature was really thinking about trans and gender nonconforming people. That would be that acronym. I was thinking about what if we actually start from the lives of women and trans and gender nonconforming people when I did my research. A lot of the research that talked about lesbian spaces was that they were invisible. There was an expectation, and it is true, that women and trans people possess less capital and power. And also there was an assumption of women's fear in the city, which didn't at all match up with this idea of the gayborhood or the gay bar. The other thing I really wanted to address was how do we actually think about using the word intersectional feels like we never do it enough. So I'd say that knowing that of how we deal with sexuality, gender, race, education, disability, and class. Also, I was a little nervous, and so I'm embarrassed to say that I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement to thank the Osage, Cherokee, and Shawnee people of what is now known as Kentucky, and also the Nipmuc people of what is now known as Massachusetts, where I am at the present moment, for letting me be here and reside here. And I don't want to do that in any sort of vague, open way to thank Native and Indigenous people, really to think about how claims to land and territory are made. And reading Black and Indigenous feminism especially has heavily influenced my work. So coming back to these questions, the other thing that stood out to me besides the elements of identity was really about how things have changed over time. A lot of LGBTQ geographies would write about pride, and 1 year of pride as if pride existed in that way for all time. And there were a lot of people citing materials from very different moments in time, and they would talk about the context and the different geography, but not about what changed over time. And that really inspired my work. So just to jump right in there, what if there was a map of places that New York City lesbians and queers most often identified with or reminisced about? So I made this video quite a time ago, and you're going to actually see all the spaces from the 1980s that were mentioned more than 10 times or more by my participants, and then you'll see some of them fade away. Most lesbian queer places don't last that long. Now the 1990s would come in, and you'll see some of them fade away, and they don't last as long because of that lack of capital and power to make space, especially in a city so expensive as New York. Here comes the 2000s, and you'll see that different spaces are congealing in different ways, and then they disappear again. And then finally, I realized this is not a territorial model. This is not an assumption of claiming a gayborhood, but more that these spaces are knit together by these women and trans and gender nonconforming people's bodies over time. And those are actually the boroughs or counties of New York City. And so it brought me to this idea of constellations, which is a navigational, how do we orient through space, calendrical, what are the iterations and temporalities of these spaces that aren't always permanent, and conceptual production of space that is definitely multiscalar and thinks about lesbian queer places as something that come and go like stars in the sky, that are much more fragmented and fleeting, rather than this territorial assumption of the gayborhood, and are bound by the bodies that move between them. So this is the main idea of the book, Constellations. And just very briefly, because I hate people who don't show you a map of New York City, we're mostly going to be talking about the southern part of Manhattan and the northern part of Brooklyn, the blue and the red there, and some neighborhoods you've probably heard of because of movies. Greenwich Village, Park Slope, Crown Heights, and Bed-Stuy actually make up the core chapters of my book. You might also be thinking, my gosh, why did you write another book about New York? Do we really have to hear this? So as a heads up, this is actually the first lesbian history of New York City. I told people for 10 years while I was writing it, hoping that someone else would write the first one. They did not. And there are actually very few LGBTQ monographs about New York City. It's mostly memoirs. And even though most people link the modern lesbian and gay movement back to New York City and the Stonewall Riot in 1969, which we've heard so much about, and obviously there were many more actions that took place that fed into Stonewall, there's an assumption of queerness in New York that's really bound together, and I wanted to critically examine that and push us to think differently about how space is produced, and if that's really equal or just, and how not. So how do you tell the story of those made invisible? I had lived in New York already for some years, so I decided to interview people who identified as lesbian and queer, I use those two terms to be as broad as possible in thinking about how people identified across generations, people who came out between 1983 and 2008 from the AIDS epidemic to the L word. They spent most of their time in New York City. People have different ideas about how those identities are used, but they were used very uniquely by my participants across time. Although older participants, people who come out earlier would use lesbian, and people who come out more recently would tend to use queer. They shared mental maps of spaces and places important to them, and also artifacts important to them around coming out. So coming out was helpful in fixing on what happened at a certain moment and remembering that. I did multi-generational focus groups, so the 80s and 90s and O's would all talk to one another, and then talk separately so they could reflect. I was age 6 when my study period started. So there was a lot I needed to learn about the exact moment of New York City at different times. So I spent over a year doing archival research at the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn. And they have over 22 different collections, but the collections I needed to focus on had an actual geographic element to them and a time and date. And so I focused on their organizational record collection and 25 years of publications. And I'll talk to those very briefly at the end of this. But for the most part, for this book, it was really reading the interviews and the maps and the artifacts, over that archival research. Finally, I put my core ideas online on a password-protected participatory focus group blog, and all of my participants got to critique and contribute to my theory, Lesbians Love Theory. They have many theories and opinions about how their lives are the way they are, and they were incredibly smart. I mean, their ideas are what are this book, so I also want to thank them too, and thank all the people who contributed to the archives who made my research possible. So why this period? If you don't know a lot about the 80s, there was the AIDS epidemic, and ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is probably the most famous group. It actually became international, with different groups organizing, doing really radical, interesting organizing. Then moving into queer identities and queer nation and the lesbian Avengers, and then this really heavy consumerism and commercialism of the L word, where everyone is white or light-skinned, very feminine, very quintessentially attractive, and the rainbow pilgrimage, where you too could visit the, quote, queer Mecca of New York and pay homage. And this was branded by the city of New York in 2008. So how did we go from the AIDS epidemic, like the violence you can see in that top image, recalling COVID at this moment, all the way to the L word and this like heightened branding. So that also interests me. So the structure of my book is a preface and intro to kind of set up the theories that guided me. I really drew on a lot of queer and feminist theory and urban political economy as a geographer. My training is actually as an environmental psychologist, and I became an American Studies scholar in the process of writing this. So I draw across a lot of disciplines and theories and do a lot of digital work as well. The 3 core chapters are about neighborhoods, and you might say, well, that's kind of odd. You just told me we're not totally focused on territoriality. Well, in fact, my participants would talk about how important neighborhoods were to them, and then they'd say, oh, it didn't work for me, or I was a failure, I couldn't keep it, or this is how I would move through it. And so it was really important to actually dig into the way that they envisioned and embraced space and place, and show how it did or didn't work in those neighborhoods. And then finally, the last chapter is the one I'm going to focus on today, and that's really pulling together my theoretical contribution of constellations. So I thought I would walk you through that since we have a short, fun time. I'm so excited about a 20-minute talk. So stars, how do we start with stars? A lot of the lesbian queer research is about placemaking and embodiment. I can't go too much into the blue star, but this really interested me about what is a lesbian queer place. This was something that my participants were really nervous about, especially when they made maps. This is a map from Eva, who's white and middle class. She came out in 1998, and you're gonna see, she has that body up there in the right-hand corner that she says is isolated from space and place. She was somebody who, because she wasn't into the bar scene, as you can see, it's crossed out on the left-hand side, she was really into theater and bookstores, and she said, my lesbian spaces were every bookstore shelf that says queer, gay, lesbian, homosexuality. The LGBT Center, I've gone to things there. I heart Netflix, Googling. For the History Archives on 14th Street, that's in Brooklyn. Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. In June, Pride, and the East Village Queer Theater. I've seen some great lesbo plays in the East Village, so that's mine, and it's always fragmented. this notion of like what is fragmented was quite profound. And while Eva doesn't talk about it, she's crossed out the bar scene. If she had gone to the bar scene and parties, she would have thought that it was also quite fleeting. Many of my participants would refer to a space and then say, it's closed now. Across 25 years, across all different races and classes, the sentiment of it's closed now, and how places are forever gone and not replaced. And those kind of ideas of the fragmented and fleeting kind of really started to guide my work and lead me to the stars. At the same time, there was also this pattern of lines and paths. Finn Enke, who's written this utterly beautiful book called Finding the Movement about the upper Midwest and lesbian history in the 70s, says that she would go to the archives, or they would go to the archives to research lesbian spaces, and they would read one version of a story, but when they talked to lesbians about those spaces, there were all of these travel stories, what Desserteau calls travel stories about getting to and from spaces. I don't know, I'm constantly mentioning sociologists today and not geographers. I feel so silly. Those kind of travel stories are really important in my work as well. Networks, again, kept coming up and keeps coming up in the literature without any critical idea of how it's geographic, so that really interested me. Also, mobilities that Andrew Gorman-Murray and Catherine Ash, geographers, have talked about really beautifully in the last year. They've written something like a dozen papers in the last few years using their work in Sydney and Toronto and comparing it. And also an obvious shout out to Sarah Ahmed's orientations, which she creates a queer phenomenology from her own lesbian experience, which extremely guided my work and also fed into constellations. So one of the lines that really stood out to me that participants would tell me while we were sitting down or while we were leaving, and so no one actually said it when I was recording, was about the LGBT Center. We would be leaving, walking to the subway after our interviews, and they would say, oh, you know, when I was leaving the LGBT Center, I always had to walk on the same side of the street because there was a cat collar across the street. And I realized that these stories span 10 years, so that people were actually taking not only the same path to go over to Henrietta Hudson's or other sorts of bars, but literally walking on the same side of the street. But I'm going to show you some lines about where people couldn't go. This is Naomi. She is Black and middle class, and her map is this shape of Manhattan that goes up and down, and then there's Brooklyn and Queens on the right-hand side. You see Greenwich Village on the Lower East Side. The Les is not a lesbian, but it's fun to claim it that way. So Greenwich Village on the Lower East Side, and she's put a line down the middle. And I said, that's really odd. There isn't actually a line that goes down Manhattan. There's no street that does that. And she responded by saying, oh, there's the line. It's actually something I do to this day. Apparently there's a spot, and my girlfriend pointed it out, where I would drop hands. One day she was like, why'd you do that to me? You're not proud of me. And then 3 white working middle class women responded, nodding, And I didn't even realize. I had trained myself that just, if you're walking, you just drop hands, because once I hit 6th Avenue, which is in the middle of Manhattan in the southern area, in the Village, you drop hands. Then you get to the East Village and you can hold hands again. And the group laughed. There were lots of really awkward and tragic moments of laughter once I transcribed everything, that I realized that things I was laughing along to, things I was nodding along to when my participants said, well, it was fortunate I've never been hit. I'm lucky I've never been raped. And not realizing kind of the violence that we live in at the same time. Simultaneously, Naomi here, no one is addressing the fact that Naomi is a Black woman who is navigating space, and what it was like for her to actually, she was actually hit while crossing 6th Avenue at one point, and that's why holding hands with a girlfriend still doesn't, to this day, at least a decade ago. And so how space and place are formed is heavily racialized. And it was so as well in all the places that they talked about, who had access to spaces, having to show 4 forms of ID to get into some bars. People thought this was something that happened to gay men. This is definitely something that happened in lesbian and queer spaces too. In comparison, there's Sally, who actually got to New York City about a decade after Naomi. So although she came out in 95, and she actually had drawn a line between Greenwich Village and Lower East Side, and without any prompting, she said, I have this route from Meow Mix on the Lower East Side, which is a bar, over to Henrietta's and Ruby Food in Greenwich Village, also bars, and that whole area. Because how are we going to get from the Lower East Side over there? It was always like, are we going to take a cab? We never take cabs. And while Sally feels really empowered, she's not also realizing that Giuliani that Giuliani, yes, when he was mayor of New York, has militarized the landscape. And part of that was, I think, a drastic increase in lighting. Although the Department of Transportation doesn't record the increase in lighting. I've talked to many New Yorkers who remember the drastic increase in lighting. Sally's assumption that she can even take a cab is a white notion, right? This is extreme whiteness and white possession that claims to how one can navigate the city. Naomi later said, we would never take cabs. We would use someone's whiteness to take a cab, or boobs, or white boobs. She was quite funny. But here we can see and juxtapose this notion of where people could or couldn't go, and the lines that are shaped that form lesbian queer constellations, again, are very much based on race and class. And I could go into disability and education, but don't have time. So going on, how does this all come together? So then there are actual constellations. Again, very much like orientations in some ways, and then some ways not. I don't have the time to talk about that. But not territoriality is one idea I wanted to put forward. Not that territoriality has to be a bad thing. Obviously, people need to be in space, but when it's connected and dependent upon white cis heteropatriarchy and its property ownership, the notion of the American dream and claim to space, that's what absolutely doesn't work. My use of the term constellations, by the way, I'm absolutely not the only person to use it. The really brilliant Latinx geographer Maggie Ramirez, working with indigenous geographer Michelle Daigle, incredible, wonderful people. Michelle is Mushkegowuk Cree, have been theorizing across their two sites about how constellations of relationality and connection can work across different approaches and marginalizations to create social change. Also, there's Leanne Betsamoki Simpson, who's Anishinabeg, who's an indigenous feminist writer, as we have always done, one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. Read that more than my book, it's so good. Who writes about constellations as a radical form of relationality and to remember the stars that come down to the sky. And how do constellations look? Well, my best way to explain this to you is actually this group map. I had many of my participants, when they did cross-generational groups, bring their mental maps, and then they drew them onto a giant subway map. This was about, I can't give you it in meters, I apologize, 8 feet high and 6 feet long. I'm 6 feet tall, it's quite tall. And they each I asked them each to pick a different color. So we can start with Yasmin. I'm gonna walk you through this. And Yasmin's over here in the West Village. She's in the bright red, she's Latina. She grew up working class, now then identified as middle class in 08. And you see her in the West Village, and then there's a line going up and down. That was the old Pride route at that time. A big Crisco can, there was a gay men's bar. She used to dance on the giant Crisco can that they had. She's quite proud of that. The reason she's not on the rest of the map is that Yasmin realized that she was an addict and she went into recovery. And so we have this snapshot of kind of 83, 85, 86 that's really focused on the West Village, which is where someone coming out as a young person would go. But it's striking that she's not going to Lower East Side. There are places to hang out there, but they're a little bit more art oriented and so on. We do see this blue and green kind of strip across the middle from the West Village to the Lower East Side, from Susan and Sally, both white and middle class, and all the places they hung out. And then we also see a brown marker. Alex, who was Black and middle class, she said unironically she chose the brown marker, and she felt that her spaces, even in the West Village and the Lower East Side, were marginalized and literally on the margins. And so, she drew them just like that. You also see Alex's drawn quite a bit in Bed-Stuy in the bottom right corner, where she actually grew up, which is a Black working class neighborhood. But then the purple and the orange going into the 2000s, we see a lot of purple and orange, not in Manhattan anymore, which has become very gentrified, very expensive, but down here more so in Park Slope. We still see some blue and green. Park Slope, one of the most gentrified and one of the most studied sites of gentrification in the world. Was only the only lesbian neighborhood that ever existed in New York City, now known as a mother's neighborhood. And yes, it definitely came from the lesbians who did a lot of work in renting there and renovating there. But the purple and the orange that you see down there, you also see in Williamsburg, kind of in the middle of the map along the L line, Williamsburg, hipster central. If you haven't heard of that, that's where hipsters came from. And probably ended too. And then we have some purple also in Bed-Stuy. So this kind of gentrification into Black working class neighborhoods that really started in the 2000s. It was more so into Latinx neighborhoods before that, my research shows. And so if you take a step back, you can actually see lesbians and queers congregating, not so much living, right, but congregating. You see the houses, the house icons later on. First of all, in the West Village, onto the Lower East Side, and down in the Park Slope, and then exploding through the rest of Brooklyn. And this is actually the path of, you know, that hottest edge of gentrification through the city at this time. And how lesbians and queers play a role in gentrification is a core argument of the book, that they not only were key, so that many of them, namely white lesbians, really profited from that, or felt that they profited from that, but they also had a sense that they didn't get to keep these places, and they felt that they were personally a failure. There's no realization that the fact that a women's neighborhood ever existed in society, it existed in New York City, one of the most expensive cities in the world, is mind-blowing and also amazing, as much as it is based on racism and inequality and tools of gentrification. So while they gentrified, they were also being gentrified out within a few years, and that increased over time. So to take us back to constellations, again, it's this social production of space from a lesbian, queer, trans, gender nonconforming angle that really doesn't want to prioritize territoriality, property ownership, about other ways of making space that may be more fragmented and fleeting, and very much embodied and linked together through the networks of bodies. So here's the book, which I showed you, and there are amazing other lesbian, queer sociological studies like Mignon Moore, Invisible Families, about Black lesbians, and Christina Hanhart compares New York and San Francisco with not specifically a lesbian focus. I've written some articles about them if you want that, and the book is actually open access on NYU's Open Square site. So if you'd like to read it that way, that's great. And just to close, I wanted to actually show you with the Lesbian History Archives. This adorable human is Deb Adel. It is the largest lesbian archive in the world, and probably the largest organizational collection, LGBTQ, just across the genders and the identities, sexual identities. This building, this is me, this is baby me collecting information and data. Those are just 2 file drawers out of 35 that I went through, and there were also about 27 boxes to tell you how much data there was about these organizational records, and also just a whole room of publications that I tried to inventory. And so I have moved all that into a website, so if you're more of an interactive playing with kind of thing person, you can check out Gieseking.org/AQNY, and that has these 2 maps on it. This is 1,600 places in lesbian queer organizations. Over time, I'm working on building census layers underneath so you can make sense of who's living where and when, and video walkthroughs. I also created an organizational map of every lesbian queer organization. I think it's 1,200 locations. Over a third of them are actually ACT UP. They had hundreds of gatherings, I think. Yeah, like over 300 and some activist groups. While this is by the type of gathering, whether it was a mailing or an office or a ZAP, an activist action, you can also look at the types of focus that they had and see really interesting patterns. Again, the census layers and walkthroughs will come soon. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I appreciate being here with all of you. And some people always ask about the software, so there's the software that I used. And I have other data visualizations on the website. So thanks so much, and I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jack. This is amazing. This is beautiful. This is so rich. I forgot now, did you show the actual object of the book? Could you just, I love books, and there's the action.
I tried so hard, but yes, yeah. I mean, it was kind of like, how could I not mention U-hauling, right? Like, how could I not mention all these, like, you can't, like, somebody was going to be like, you didn't talk about my bar, or you didn't talk about, the Park Slope Food Co-op. So like, I was trying to get everything, and so people really felt seen too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing and pioneering work, as you say. It's the first, so thank you so much for this. I'm going to immediately give the floor. There's so much to engage with, but I'm sure that's why we have 2 discussants to pull out as much as we can. So Andrew, I'm first going to give you the floor.
Great, thank you. Dr. Gieseking, thank you so much for sharing your book and for this presentation. As a queer historian, I concur that there are not enough histories that center on lesbian, trans, and gender nonconforming people. This is often due to a dearth of written sources in the archives. Hence, when Kennedy and Davis wrote their germinal 1993 book, Boots of Leather, which you talk about a lot in your introduction, they chose to conduct oral histories to fill in gaps about knowledge from the 50s and 60s. Kennedy and Davis research has clearly had an impact on yours. And actually in a later piece, Kennedy is reflecting on these oral histories, and she says that they produce two types of truths. One are facts, and two are people's subjective experiences of key moments or events. And indeed, your multi-generational group interviews, as you call them, and the mapping projects also unearthed, a literal whole book of these truths. Some of these are the facts, the ones that could be triangulated with archival sources, like the fact that Cubbyhole used to be an entirely different bar around the corner from the current day one. I didn't know. But just as valuable, there are the subjective experiences of your interviewees, such as when Bailey talks about the simultaneous feelings of inclusion and exclusion in Park Slope as a lesbian and as a person of color in a white, wealthy neighborhood. The fact that you included so many empirical examples will be a major legacy of this book. I love that young scholars and young queers will cull the snippets from your interviews to piece together a history that they might not find in their archives. For me, the book was also a bit of a trip down memory lane, and I took some time this morning to make my own map of New York, which I moved to in 2007. And so these are my constellations. As a cisgender gay man, I knew that my map would look a little bit different. There were, of course, overlaps, like the Christopher Street Pier. My map had a lot more commercial establishments, mainly bars in the East Village and in Chelsea. As a side anecdote, anyway, well, I was going to say, but I do also have Cubbyhole and Ginger's, where my best dyke friends would take me to, and I concur that there is this warm and cozy feeling in these bars that your interviewees describe. So there were two areas that I wanted to bring up for discussion. The first is about the internet. So you mentioned that your book is not a digital geography, and that was intentional. But you do mention the internet a few times, like when Trey was Googling, where do all the gay people in the hood go? Or, and so at the same time, you also framed the book around the closing of the lesbian bar, which you rightly attribute to political economy and not to the internet. However, I, as a Grindr scholar, I often read sensational stories about how Grindr is closing the gay bar. And
oh my God, totally. Totally, absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
And I strongly disagree. I've written about this. I think that people use virtual spaces differently than they use physical spaces. So my first question was, how did your interviewees frame the relationship between online and offline spaces? I know this was 2008, so there were no smartphones yet, but there certainly was decades of internet dating, and I'm sure people might have said, oh, that's closing all the bars.
Yeah, and nobody thought that Planet Out was closing a bar. Like, people thought that Planet Out was like a really nerdy, like, hangout community. I think I had dated there. No one thought Nerve was closing a bar. OkCupid had launched. Smartphones launched in 2007, and I don't think I had one when I did. I think I maybe got one in the course of the study. I think there were a lot more connections between that people were like, wait, we've always been doing this? Like I don't know if you've all seen the Lesbian Herstory Personals, which is now the Lex app, which I'm personally excited and obsessed with and want to, and I plan to study next. And these are just, I can actually bring it up, like text-based personals that, where can the internet see, right? These are all text-based personals, so there's no pictures. Netflix while black, right? And it's really, it recalls this very like, my cat is sitting, okay, right? These very like 80s, 90s, like 2000s personals thing that people are much more comfortable with. It was an Instagram account, Herstory Personals, that became its own app. And I think there's a lot more kind of connections and the range of like, I have chronic pain, you can, like, could somebody come hang out with me and sit outside the window, I'm alone, or, you know, like high BDSM demands. And so I think the internet really didn't close these bars. I think people will go to a lesbian bar and not also talk to one another. Like the lesbian stand around is what one of my participants called it. Like they're not going to get that, like there's an expectation of, I might not hook up with someone. I had a couple of participants who always hooked up with someone. Everyone was like, how do you do that? Can you explain to us? That sounds amazing. And I think that the internet was also kind of, they were a little bit nervous about Facebook. The first virtual march had just happened and they had all signed up, and then people went to the webpage that day and nothing happened. They just had clicked a button. And they're like, what is this? Like, what's happened to our movement? Like first we had the marriage and military, and now we're just clicking a button on Facebook. So there was like a real apprehension and fear. But things like Instagram hadn't launched, or, you know, Twitter wasn't doing what it's doing now. So that kind of like how social movements worked, like wasn't yet imagined. I do think that like Kate McKinney's book, Information Activism, is like the best thing ever about kind of like pre-internet, like it's about the history of lesbian databases and lesbians making their own knowledge and controlling like how knowledge and ideas are shaped. She's a comm studies scholar. And they're a comm studies scholar. Stay now. Gosh, 2 days. So sorry. As someone who's trans. That book is like really telling to me. And also they just released a special issue on HIV/AIDS and the internet and how ideas of what goes viral actually came from AIDS. So I think like how the internet has like fed into queer life is quite central, like all along, like Usenet groups, like all the great work on Usenet groups and bulletin boards. But I think at that time, most of my participants were a little bit really like the one thing that was exciting to them the most was Wikipedia. Like there's an official entry and it doesn't hate me. And that's amazing. Like, where can I go and be Christian and gay? Oh, there's a church for that. Like that was mind blowing. And I think it shaped the need to, the one thing it did was I didn't have to go to a bar to find someone for them to explain how life worked. I could use the Google. And I think that changed things more than the dating.
If I may suggest, because I can, I'm thinking that maybe Ladan, you might have also a question that relates to this, right? So maybe you can do that question first, and then we come back to your second question, Andrew. Yeah.
Do I only ask a question, or do I just present my intervention?
Oh, do that too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah's muted. Sarah, you're muted.
Yes,
What do you
Yes, I'm muted. I'm sorry. No, I was just thinking, because Ladan, you also work on digital sociology. I was thinking like probably there's a direct follow-up. So it's more if there's a direct follow-up on this, Ladan, go for it. And otherwise you do your presentation after Andrew. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. Yeah. It wasn't really a question, actually. I did have a follow-up, but it's not really a question. I was going to talk about how this notion of constellation as geographical imagination was so, so motivational for me, because I do work with Iranian queer on digital spaces. And I was thinking that for many Iranian queer, urban spaces are too hostile to claim any form of territory, although of course they exist. So these territories exist on maybe in small scales in larger cities such as Tehran and Shiraz, for instance. But a large number of queer Iranians go online to produce these forms of spaces. And I was thinking about these, the notion of constellations that you use has a lot to do with presence, but it also has to do with interruption. You give very good examples right now with holding hands and the cab example, where people can identify and then disassociate themselves with that identity. to survive. And you also use Jose Esteban Munoz's concept of queer survival there. So I was thinking that that was such an amazing model for me to think through and make sense of my my data. So it was more a comment rather than a question, actually.
Cool. Yeah, I want to talk more.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. My second question is going in a different direction about urban migration. So you say in the introduction that you are writing against metronormativity, or the idea that queer life exists in urban areas, or that you have to move to an urban area to truly come out. And you also write that you are writing against metronormativity paradoxically through a history of New York City. So could you just clarify that a little bit more? How did the narratives in your book challenge the idea that queer life exists in the city?
I don't think they did challenge it. I think they rested quite heavily on being very privileged and being very much that they were smarter than rural queers or suburban queers, that they got away. Some of them had those ideas. Some people had come from really rural suburban environments and like things were better. And I think I wrote this book, I finished writing this book in Kentucky, which is a very rural queer, and queerness is very different there. Like I've had people say to me, well, I wouldn't hold hands. I don't want to put it in anyone's face. And I was like, what? And my urban New York response is like, oh, that's so 2000, whatever. And no, that's not an acceptable response. Like different geographies have different ideas. And I think that what came out of this book, it's like you set me up for this, is like the next book is about how much the claims to urbanism and privilege then gave them this sense of entitlement to make these spaces, like exceptionalism. Oh, and also sitting here, not as a setup, is this amazing book by Ghassan Moussaoui, Disruptive Situations about Queer Beirut, if you haven't seen it, which is really looking at exceptionalism and modernity and thinking about the links of Paris and Beirut. But it's something I've been thinking about for a while, like thinking about queering settler cosmopolitanism is what I'm calling the next book. And I think that they didn't, and it's something I'm going back through. And also there was a very privileging of New York. Well, I went to Brussels and they only had one gay bar, one lesbian bar. Can you believe it? We have 6. We're so much better. And there are 15 lesbian bars left in the world, and 3 in the United States, and 3 of them, just the United States, 3 of them are in New York City. So like 1/5 of the lesbian bars are in New York City. Is pretty profound. And that is also a sense of entitlement. Like we're doing queerness better. We're doing lesbianness better. And I really want to intervene in that. So I was writing against metronormativity. My participants, I don't think were. Yeah. I think that needs to be rethought on like a whole queer movement scale. Really. Yeah. That's what the next is. Thanks for asking about that.
Yeah. Andrew, are you happy for now?
Yeah.
Happy for now. Ladan, go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this talk, Jack, and thanks a lot for inviting me as well to this panel. I picked up your book on Tuesday, and I really feel honored to be one of the first people who actually, you were so generous, we received the PDF, so I'm really happy to have been one of the first people in the first 2 months of the publication of your book to have read it. I had my midterm grading this week, and I thought, goddess, I'm not going to finish the book, but then I picked it up and I started reading, and I could not stop.
Oh, I'm so honored.
And, yes, and the interesting thing about this book for me is that unlike Sarah and Andrew, I really don't have any form of familiarity with New York. I've never been to New York. I don't know anything about the history of New York. I probably can't go to New York anytime soon for obvious reasons, but also because of the Muslim ban. So again, in spite of that, I found this book so captivating for someone like myself. So I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to first very fast go through some of the things that stood out for me. I can't cover everything, but I will just, give some insights. And then, I think I will ask maybe 2 questions, and I hope we will have time to engage with those. So what I found really very fascinating was the critical and intimate cartography of queer spaces that you used, both as a methodology and a conceptual framework. I found myself really spending a lot of time trying to making sense of those mental maps, although that was difficult for me because of not knowing really the geography of New York. And what struck me was that, as you described, these are directional and navigational maps, but On the other hand, they're not the usual navigational and directional maps. So to a trained eye that, you know, immediately sees cores and peripheries and borders and boundaries, it really wasn't like that. So the mental maps lack sense. They don't have centers. There are no margins. And I thought this was an amazing methodology to queer spatial imagination. And you presented a very interesting paradox that I think really connected all the chapters together. That queer people, on the one hand, must produce spaces to survive and also resist cis heteropatriarchy. And on the other hand, some of the ways through which they survive really pass through racial capitalism in the form of gentrification. They have to become gentrifiers to territorialize themselves. Mm-hmm. And even within this paradise, you find moments of Dyke politics, as you call it, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, and feminism in the form of, you know, building those constellations. And I thought that this notion of constellations was so amazing and so poetic, also with the story that was behind it, with the stars and the tattoos. I really encourage everyone to read this book, and this was really amazing for me to read. As I said, from my own research as well, I found it a very interesting theoretical model to think through. But also the fact that by the disappearance of these queer spaces and you know, the general discourse that we live in a post-gay, also gay-friendly society now, we do not really need these spaces anymore, because queer and lesbian women, you know, are welcome everywhere, right? So we don't really need these spaces. So the fact that within this post-gay discourse, the central narrative becomes that sexuality is no longer the primary or the central part of the identity. It is just, you know, something that is there like everything else. And you can be just like everybody else, so you don't need your own spaces. And you show so eloquently that this post-gay discourse is really very white, and it's really just fits the white and the wealthy and those who can choose to assimilate. And this made me really think of, because we actually, Andrew and myself, we do come from the migration studies. So the fact that, for instance, in the asylum context, this post-gay discourse does not apply. For the racialized asylum seekers, sexuality has to be central to their identity. There is very strict ways that their narratives of lives and identities have to be formed around their sexuality. Otherwise, they are not accepted. They are seen as suspect bodies. So you showed that there is limits and also costs to this discourse of sexuality, post-gay, and gay friendliness. And also, I find it quite interesting that within the countries. I mean, I'm teaching in the Netherlands and I live in Belgium, so I have kind of an idea about both of these contexts. Gay friendliness is so much part of the public narrative of the nation, and you know they're proud of this you know, the nation of that has that kind of post-gay identity. But again, this comes at the cost of poor people, colored people, and also lesbian and queer women of color and lower class being pushed away out of the central city. So yeah, there are lots of insights there. I just want to ask one specific question. There was a sense of loss and nostalgia and mourning about your participants because of losing these spaces. I just felt that throughout all the chapters. And it's a very general question, but what kind of a queer New York can we imagine in the future? Because you explained that this kind of the gentrification, the urban political economy, and unaffordable housing in the city is intensifying, and even for gay bars that were surviving, they're also closing off more and more. So what kind of, and maybe that's also a question for us, what kind of, you know, queer Amsterdam or Brussels can we imagine as well? And the other question that I had is that you do not really talk about age at all. You talk about generations, and then when you talk about the notion of age, you refer to the coming out moment. So that's a moment that you choose to rely on. And I was wondering, are there any age factors in the way that spaces are produced? And I'm thinking about when we talk about this queer discourse, especially you talk about, for instance, post 9/11 and newer generations, that representation of queer and lesbian people are not often only white and middle class, but also able-bodied and younger. So what does that representation then present to older queer and lesbian women? So two main questions maybe.
These are all been such dope questions. Thank you. You guys are so amazing to talk to. Yeah, I'll do the age thing first. I think the age factor was that you could go to a bar or not until the early 2000s. That's when they started checking IDs and scanning the IDs on the back. And so until then, all the lesbian bars would let you in. They just kind of like turn, that was like a gay lesbian bar thing. You would turn the other way because this person needs to have a home. And so I think that kind of like age regulation got really intense. And that's when age started to matter more than any other time. I think also like there were a few people who came out later, like in their late 20s, and all of them had already had a lot of lesbian friends. And they're like, yeah, I was a little late to the game and didn't need to go to a bar. I was already dating someone. So they kind of skipped going to some spaces, but they went to a lot of activist spaces and they still went to the park. So they already gone to the park. So they'd already like had a CS, a community supported agriculture, and hung out in Prospect Park and went to softball games. So there was like they'd already had an infrastructure. So I think that would be the biggest difference. Arlene Stein's written like really amazing stuff about lesbian generations and age, really. And then I was really interested in this coming out moment because I thought, what is it like to come out when AIDS, there's no like it's just a death sentence. That's totally different than like coming out in the 90s and there's all this hopeful moment and there's some sort of meds and maybe things will be okay. And then like coming out in the marriage and military movement, it's like wah wah. Like those are different ways of like seeing the world. The sense of loss and nostalgia. Yeah, it shaped everything, right? Even if they had just come out, they were sorry about what they missed. What kind of a queer New York we imagine in the future? People are leaving New York, right? And lots of queers are leaving New York and they're moving upstate for the winter in these spaces. And what will it look like? Like, how can New York be a new queer space? All these cities, right? As people leave cities, I think about it all the time. I'm like keen to like move back and do research like at that moment and be like, what world are you going to be and what does it look like? And people creating I think mutual aid has shaped in those efforts. I think like the Black Lives Matter movement during COVID, this iteration of it, has vastly changed. That someone asked me, did your participants identify as anti-racist? I was like, only one white participant did, the rest identified as non-racist. And I think now, like when I interview people, I would be shocked if they didn't all say they were anti-racist, if they all hadn't gone to a protest and a march and they all weren't committed to this cause, that they all weren't, reading something and learning something about Indigenous life and history, and they all didn't know what land they were on. I think it's like a very different mindset. So I think like whatever gets built next is going to come from that, and it's going to be it's actually going to be, I don't know if it will ever really be anti-racist if white people are leading it, so hopefully not. But hopefully there will be a lot more lesbian, queer, color leadership in those spaces. And I think it will be like inevitably. And I think some of the spaces like Blue Stockings Bookstore have always been like that. And yeah, I think that will be the beautiful thing that comes next. That's my hope. Can't think of the sad things at the moment, just because I can't imagine it.
Thank you. I think we've already have a couple of questions now, so I want to bring the questions in. I would also really want to invite Andrew and Ladan if they want to jump in. Like, I think the questions are in first instance addressed to you, Jack, but if you want to jump in and have a conversation, feel very free. So the first question comes from Emily Shield. First, thank you. This is amazing, fascinating, and important work. What was the impetus behind starting the maps in 1983? Was that a product of who you had in your focus groups, or was it more intentional? Was there a different story for lesbian, non-gender conforming people who were active in New York City, say in the 1970s?
So thank you, Emily, for being so kind. That's awesome. And I think the 83 I didn't want to pick 81 was 81 is when the first gay cancer article appears in the New York Times. And I didn't, because for some of my participants would have felt like that was about gay men, even though they were in the AIDS crisis equally. All of them talked about that. Like I went to a different funeral every week, one of my participants said, for years. I wanted to just start in a year that wasn't important. And Castells wrote The City and the Grassroots. Cedric Robinson wrote Black Marxism, Imagine Communities, Benedict Anderson. There was just like this moment of books in 1983 that like grounded all of the work that I did. So I decided to start it then. I was told by many 70s lesbians that it was going to be useless because I wasn't looking at the 70s, which I love about them. They're very assured of themselves and they did such important work. And also I liked the idea of 25 years, and I was doing the work in 2008. I did not know there was going to be a foreclosure crisis, obviously. Some of my colleagues did. And so kind of like thinking about multi-generations, like at what point would I stop? My advisor and my committee really wanted me to do less. Was there a different story for lesbian, gender nonconforming people who are active in the 70s? I think that like there were I call it the F to M, a word we don't use very much, but female to male trans surge of the early 2000s, because that's the words they would have used then. But there were many more trans women in the 70s and 80s. And I think in part of that's like the early internet and trans tapestry. And I still don't know how they were getting estrogen. I have no idea. I don't know. That's something I really want to learn about. What happens in the early 2000s, because we don't have socialized medicine, is that the LGBT health centers in the US started giving away hormones to hopefully like curb the suicide rates of trans people that were moving to all their cities and support them. And so like that doesn't really, like those huge numbers don't happen until the 2000s. Even my participants didn't know. They're like, where did all these trans people come from? Isn't that interesting? I mean, that's like, I like putting this in the book. I hope it makes sense. I bet there are other reasons too that people can add to it. I was dating a social worker who explained it to me. So big shout out to Nicole. I don't know about the 70s and trans and gender nonconforming people. But there are people who are working on that now. And I think, one thing you can check out is the Digital Transgender Archive, which is just amazing if you've never seen it. It's just incredible and tremendous. And Erin DeVore, who's the archivist, will definitely make time to meet with you and point you to resources if you want to know.
Okay, and then we have Benazir Ibrahim, who points out to a book that you might not find in the archives, which is Black on Both Sides,
Right.
A Racial History of Trans Identity. Alisa Jabenko writes, hi, thank you for your presentation. I am working now on the topic of lesbian space in Moscow, Russia in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Have you come across the idea of creating an imaginary lesbian space in the community of that time? Do you have some thoughts about this?
That's really cool. First of all, Benazir, thank you. I love that book. I totally teach that book. And it came, so there, I had to stop reading when I wrote the book. That's something horrible you have to do. And so that book came out right after, but definitely shapes a lot of what I do now. Alyssa, so I actually spent 2 years in Germany on a fellowship and interviewed all these lesbians and queers about their spaces from 83 to 08. And mind blowing for me to be told by these women who grew up East German in the 80s that they had to go to Catholic churches to like find community, that they were going to underground events in Catholic churches. So I do think that there were like ways of like finding, there's always ways of finding one another for some people, like not everyone latches into that. I don't know if I would use the Imagine Communities literature though. It kind of like gets you only so far. And then everyone kind of like uses it in some papers and we've stopped using it for a while. So I wouldn't fall into that. I don't know, but I'm also thinking about asking Mariana Pavlovskaya, who's at Hunter CUNY, who does work on women's labor and gender, especially in Moscow over time. And she would have really cool ideas for you. So those are the things that come to mind. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. And then there's a question by Evin Chavez. Thanks a lot for this lecture and all of your research. As ELC, Euro Central Asian Lesbian Community, we are trying to recover both her stories as well as lesbian spaces. I wonder if Dr. Gieseking has any suggestions of recovering those, or more probably create new spaces. So the question of recovery, but also of creating new spaces.
Yeah. I think it's like, how do you want to, like, if you want to create an archive, I think that's really amazing. So I was just talking to this really cool group in Cologne, Germany, Cologne, and they were talking about, you know, trying to figure out how would they make a map or a shared map, and then start, you know, how would they archive that, and what would it be, and what would stay on the map or not. And we spent like, I just spent a day like talking to them about the maps that they made or the ideas they had. And that was really exciting. I think it's, you know, whatever your group of people is most excited on, that has the energy to carry them forward for any amount of time, especially during COVID. Like, what's going to make people happy? Is it like collecting people's stories and making like a secret digital archive, or like a public digital archive? Or is it like collecting maps and doing storytelling or interviewing one another? Like, there's the Trans Oral History Project in New York that's awesome, where people just ask a friend to interview them, and then these oral histories are transcribed and posted. So I think like recovery, there's like so many ways, like just looking at these different books and archives and sites, and then whatever thrills you, because it's hard right now. And so if that's gonna, you know, keep you swimming, that's just the best thing ever. I do think oral histories are amazing. I do think, yeah. And what things people keep with them, you know, like the artifact thing, I don't talk about a lot in the book, but like the 80s brought all these, was really like a political economy share. The 80s brought all these like buttons that said like, dip me in chocolate and throw me to the lesbians, or I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles, and I'd walk even farther for that thing you do with your tongue. They were just really priceless. But then the 90s, and they were all DIY. You could see that like some nice lesbian had brought them to the march and made them in her little like thing in there. And then the 90s was all this rainbow plastic crap. And it's like, who was making that? And who made money off of all these gays and queers and lesbians and transes and bisexuals buying this rainbow crap, this plastic stuff? Like, I had those pride rings, they cost $16, that were 9 cents to make. And so, and then the 2000s was all about like the L word, and across it was all these things from exes. So, you know, recording stories of exes, people love to talk about their exes. That's something that I'm sure people would tell you about. Yeah. I think it's like how people want to represent themselves and what stories they want to save is really important. So like gathering together and figuring that out. And then, yeah. And you can also email me. I talk to you more. So,
yeah. Great. And I think this is, oh, is there another question in the chat? Oh yeah. Thank you so much, Jack. I wonder what relationship, in your opinion, the book has with Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. It seems as if gentrification is seen different between the two texts. Delaney's gentrification removes and threatens sexual subculture, whereas yours is one that queers move within and sometimes create themselves.
wow. Is this Eliza's question? No?
No, sorry. This is a question by Joe Jukes.
Oh, okay. Now I can see it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I had to read. Oh, where'd you go? Oh, sorry. Wait, can you read that again, Sarah? Because I read them as I go. And I was reading Eliza's and go.
It's actually in the chat if you prefer to see it.
Chat. Aha. Hey,
yeah.
Joe. Oh,
I'm also going back and forth between the Q&A and the chat. So it's in the chat, and maybe you should just mention that there was first another comment in the chat. Thank you for a delightful morning, Jack and Andrew. Miss you and loved all of the nostalgia myself, from Jana. Jana?
All the love to Tink Lady Spring. Jana is actually an amazing queer voice in the history of the world, I think. Has created this incredible queer trans commune that you can look up, Tink Lady Spring. I will type it into the chat, and you can follow them on Instagram, and they have amazing, really thoughtful, anti-racist, pro-indigenous, really critical, amazing politics that inspire me, and I think they're amazing. So Joe, yeah, isn't it amazing, Andrew? It's amazing. Joe, oh my gosh, I got to email Samuel Delaney, who goes by Chip. That was a life highlight, truly, because Sam's Chip's book just, I'm supposed to call him Chip, got re-released, or we're all supposed to actually, after 20 years with NYU. And I think I think that book was really inspiring to me, but there was like a lot about like how masculinity worked and how masculinity could take up spaces. And I was like, I just like the amount of women and trans people assigned female births who were raised as girl children are not like masturbating in New York Times theaters. Like there's not a sense of safety. In fact, when I asked people about public sex, because cruising, like I think like Delaney's book is so brilliant and so smart. And I think like the Michael Warner stuff that was written, the Delaney, Lauren Berlant, Sex in Public, all of Michael Warner stuff. There was this moment in like the 2000s where cruising came to define queer space. And so I asked a lot of my participants, like, what do you think about cruising and public sex? And they're like, it's very dirty. I was just like, And they're like, I wouldn't lay down in a park. And I was like, oh my God, we lay down. Like the actual geography of sex, of the body, is different for the boys than the girl. And I'm very generalizing those genders, please forgive me. And also like women assigned female birth, maybe not with the T or with the estrogen, trans women, orgasms take longer and become more psychological. I don't feel safe in a park was a lot of what my participants said, which makes sense. And I was like, oh wow, like our actual sex is different. And that's cool. That's so cool they can do that, but that's not what queer space is. I wound up writing about U-hauling as like a radical lesbian queer form of production of space. I love the U-hauling. It seems as if gentrification is seen different. Removes and threatens sexual subculture, where it's one of the queers movement sometimes. I feel like also like Chauncey's note, privacy could only be had in public. Like that is mine, like is just like a mic drop when you read it in the verse, like publicness can only be had in private for people assigned female at birth. And so like, while Chauncey's talking about all these boys like secretly hooking up, like you can think about the history that he couldn't find because we weren't arrested in that book, Gay New York. He even says, I would have studied lesbians if there's no arrest records. Like we're in houses somewhere. Like, and also like, did the long-term monogamous serial monogamy of lesbianism come from the fact we were just stuck together for so long? Like, I don't know. Like those things are super interesting to me. And I think they have like histories about like how publicness and privateness work. And I think about like what privates are. Like private space is really under theorized in geography. It's about public space and privacy. Like not right when the moment I think we're going to write about private space, 9/11 happened and became about privacy and the Patriot Act and all sorts of gross stuff in the US literature. And I don't see a lot outside of it. So I get excited about private space. So I think maybe that's what you're reading too. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, great. We have more questions. They keep on coming, Jack. Eliza Steinbuck is writing the following. Hi, Jack. Congratulations on bringing out this excellent book. Could you speak about how this book intervenes and contributes especially to digital humanities and media scholarship? I'm fascinated by the constellation concept too. Do you refer as well to Walter Benjamin's notion of constellations? Sorry, maybe you mentioned this. I came in a bit late.
I did not mention the Benjamin, but oh my God, did I have a life experience trying to really understand that. So the best way to understand what Benjamin is saying about constellations is in Jameson. It's in the book. And really, he was talking about like the constellation of ideas. And so less so about spaces. He has this idea of the monad when like everything comes together in urban political economy and there's this kind of like realization or shift. I can copy and paste that section if you want. But it's less, I even say it's less so about that, but there are definitely like lesbian queer ideas that create constellations too, or ideas or practices. Like there's definitely repeated practices of the notion, like even the jokes, like lesbian bed death, serial monogamy, U-hauling, and U-hauling is like, what does a lesbian take on a second date is a joke. And the answer is a U-haul. And the idea is like you get together really too fast and you move in together. And then I had a participant say, but like, do you know how hard it is? Like, I can't believe I found somebody and I want to make a space with them. And so the idea is to make a private space, right? So I think Benjamin feeds into the idea notion. Digital humanities, yeah. If I'm allowed to share one more second, here we go. I'm just going to share 1 second. So this is the website I built for the book. And these are the maps that we can actually look at them live. Here's this one. I think like thinking about digital humanities scholarship, I talk to a lot of people who do mapping projects. So I'll show you, this is anybody who had anything to do with AIDS. And if we click on this, like I have amazingly really detailed records about what ZAP was where. This is Queer Nation. Here's the Lesbian AIDS Project. I'm really trying to get people to have these materials on their own or to teach with them. So that's what I'm trying to do with digital humanities. I go to the American Studies Conference. The Digital Humanities Caucus is awesome. I welcome everyone to that. It's an amazing, really smart space. Those people are so welcoming and anti-racist and pro-queer and disability. But I hope that this kind of like mapping really puts the stories in people's hands. Yeah, eventually there will be a search bar so you can just see the things of ACT UP. But these sorts of maps, I think, allow people to tell their own stories. I still have to make it though that if you're not from New York, I've sent this to people at CUNY and they're like, oh, this is so great to teach with, the City University of New York. And everyone else is like, I don't know how to teach with this, clearly because they don't know New York. So I have to put a lot more like layers underneath and walkthroughs, and you should teach it in this way. So that's what I'm trying to do with that.
Yeah. Great, and I think the next question was actually by Justus Uitermark, but it seems that his timestamp is from a different time zone. So if I don't introduce a question now, he might never be able to get to the question. So Justus is asking, awesome to hear you talk about your baby. I love Sarah Schulman's memoir, The Gentrification of the Mind. I realize what she talks about mostly predates 1983, but I wonder whether you have thoughts about how the loss of imagination she describes carries over into your period.
Yeah, also if you, oh, hi Eustace, and is the lecture recorded? Yes.
Yes, the lecture is recorded and it will be posted to, and the discussion here is recorded to the website of the ASSR, the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research.
Thank you, Sarah. Eustace, it's definitely my baby, yeah. Sarah, I love the gentrification of the mind. I love teaching that. Like the students get so into that when you say, oh, this is how many people died in 9/11 and this is how many people died of AIDS. I think like that really strikes young people because they really can't connect to that. She does talk about, like she talks through the 80s actually. So yeah, it's not as clear. She doesn't use dates enough. Oh, and if you're interested in Kathy Acker, she has this whole like second half of the book when no one was talking about Kathy Acker as this really amazing artist who died very young of breast cancer. There's a whole like special issue or like a theme section in the most recent issue of Trans Studies Quarterly, TSQ, just about Kathy Acker. So if you're a Kathy Acker fan, I just saw that come out. I was really chuffed. Yeah, her notion of the gentrification of the mind, like let's get read out of space, and also like the death and replacement of like gay men dying of AIDS, and the prices of the real estate being amped up so they can make more money off of them, not allowing people to inherit. And Chauncey makes a really smart argument in that book, Why Marriage, which that's a really tight little book. I totally recommend that, about like why there was even an impetus towards marriage, and a lot of it was about AIDS, like having no inheritance rights. I do think the loss of imagination is real. I don't know if you've ever seen Sarah speak, but she just gets very angry that the kids today are not getting it. And like, I'm always nervous when I'm on a panel with her that she's gonna yell at me, and she seems to like me. So I'm really relieved. But I do think she's right. But I think there was this moment in my research where like, there was a focus group in like the 80s and 90s, Noahs were all talking. And this woman, Gertrude or something, 84, came out in 84. I can't remember what I call her in the book. I don't want to call her real name. It was like, oh, when I got evicted, and the people who came out in the 90s, Noahs were like, oh, why'd you get evicted? And she's like, because I was gay. And they were like, oh, and it was this weird, it was the only group interview where everything kind of broke down and I couldn't get to a state of repair. And then the next group I had was a 90s group and an O's group where the same people went, and they're like, I'm so embarrassed. Like, how did I not know we could get evicted until 1987? I'm so embarrassed. How did I not know I was alive and it's part of my life? And I was like, there's no book. Like, I literally once got up at the Lesbian History Archives to go check the book that I was writing to be like, is that when that happened? And I was like, oh shit, right? Like, there is no book. Like, there is no understanding. Like, stop beating up on yourselves, which assigned female at birth are people are prone to. And then many of them, not all of them. And then went to the group with the woman from the 80s, Gertrude, and she's like, these kids today think it's all like the L word. And I think like there are no resources. I think Sarah creates resources and she calls out people and asks them to be more accountable. And I think like the imagination of a world where there's like 6 bars just in New York, right? And that there's like dozens of parties, like from the turn of the century, like that's going to be mind blowing to people. Right. And I think maybe some of them will want to make spaces like that again, or create spaces like that. So I hope, and yeah, I hope that kind of like bringing back history into the present helps.
Yeah, and I think, but I forgot the title. I think there's a new book coming out by Sarah Schulman on, and others, on the oral histories of ACT UP, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I don't know when it's coming out, but you can also watch those online. Yeah, there's just an oral history ACT UP. Yeah, and fun to teach with. Also, she was really heavily involved in the movie United in Anger, and she hates the movie How to Survive a Plague, which was a thing that got nominated for an Oscar. So actually they're super fun to teach with or watch as a comparison, because How to Survive a Plague is like becomes about this one white guy's story. And United in Anger is just this really raw footage that she put together. I mean, with Jim Hubbard is really the director. And United in Anger is free on the YouTubes. They put it on there. Yeah, so, but the oral histories are amazing. Sometimes I just, after I was thinking Trump might win on Tuesday morning, I was like, what did they do? I'm gonna go back and listen to the people of ACT UP again. Like, how did they do it?
Yeah. We have, which might be our last question, unless people, there's probably a little bit more time. So if people still have a burning question, now is the time to write it down. But we have, for the moment, a last question from Tinaye Gibbons. Hi, thank you so much for this, and I can't wait to read your book. I am currently working on rural queer spaces in Georgia with my university. We are purposefully not looking at Atlanta and the counties surrounding it, and I was wondering your thoughts on southern lesbian spaces as well as the intersection of rural spaces. Great question.
We need a jam. Oh my gosh, I'm reading so much about this stuff. Yeah, I think that there's so many more resources than I think that we think there are. And I think there are like more documentaries and more ways of approaching this. I don't know if everyone followed the Queer Appalachia saga and Evil Doing. So Queer Appalachia, I'm sure Tina did. Queer Appalachia is an Instagram account with over 275,000 followers. And it was like, just like really great memes and really great content, and supposedly very pro-Black and pro-Indigenous, and and they did a lot of fundraisers, and come to find it, you can look at the Washington Post article about this. Truth be told, they were actually stealing money from people and not using all the money that they said they were giving to Black and Indigenous trans people, or not working in solidarity with them, and using their names and images to make this change. And I think Queer Appalachia, I want to write about it in the next book, is really important because so many urban people started to look at the queer South for the first time with respect. And so there's this, and I think there were a lot of queer Southerners who were like, oh, we exist in this way, with like a lot of sparkly Dolly Parton, and like, how can we connect to one another? So I think there's like a shift right now where queer orality is different. Like, I'm totally down with the anti-urbanism movement of Scott Herring, but and Karen Tongson is just like, great, another freaking book about New York, which I actually quote her on in my book. And I'm like, yeah, sorry, buddy. I think that there's like amazing researches and like archives that are being collected. And like, if you search, if you set up a Google alert, there's a lot that comes out on Southern lesbian space, and like queer rurality or queer rural. And going back in time in news. And there's a lot of like archives that are located at different places. Something that an archivist said to me at the University of Kentucky, and it blew my mind. I was like, oh, what kind of like queer archives would be at the university? I wasn't even thinking about it, but it never occurred to me to look there. And she's like, oh, well, the Episcopalians on campus did all the work of teaching everyone about AIDS. And I was like, whoa, that's wild. And there's all this history of AIDS at University of Kentucky, because of the Episcopalians. And so I think it's like really having to read, there's the Ann Stoler thing, like it's a slant, I forget which direction, against the grain, with the grain, again, yeah, do both. Which one is it, Andrew? Is it against?
Along
the grain, yeah.
Along the grain, it says a grain in there. To like find sources that you don't think are there. And I would be really interested. You're not looking at, but Decatur is so interesting. And Decatur is a lesbian neighborhood, if there ever was one in Atlanta. And still there are a lot of lesbian spaces there. And I wonder about how people see Decatur. So even if you don't interview people, like, what is the imagination of that space if they're rural? And where do they go? I also wonder about like queers in the opioid epidemic. Like, Okay, yeah, I'm going to start heroin. Why is that? I live out here. Okay, something also that Queer Appalachia said really often, like a lie. I know so many people who died of the opioid epidemic, and I've never seen sexuality listed in any U.S. National Science Foundation study as an opioid study reason. And we love to find opioid study research in this country. So I think that's really interesting and really amazing. And there's also just the land. Oh my gosh, stuff on lesbian land is underdone. And we could not get, did you know that women could not get it, not in every state couldn't get a credit card in the United States of America till 1976? No wonder when we started these things, we did not know what we were doing, right? And everybody was like, oh, I thought Susie would pay me because she loved me. Yeah, no way, Susie didn't have any money, right? So I think like how political economy worked on the lesbian land, there's very little that people have actually recorded about what went wrong. And I think people hold these stories really tight about the racism, about the domestic violence, about rape, about fear, about the fights, and that they're embarrassed. And I think like if we could get people to like find a space where they feel safe to share that, I think we'd find there's really amazing histories that are there too.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Jack, I'm going to thank you for this amazing sharing and generosity, intellectual generosity, the beautiful book that you shared with us. I also really want to thank Andrew and Ladan for engaging with this, and also all the participants for engaging and all the interesting questions. For those for whom it might not have been clear at the start of this webinar, read the book, get the book, read the book, and I hope that we can continue bits and pieces of these conversations in different spaces, in different constellations. So yes, it's time. Thank you all very much, and we will, through the ArcGIS newsletter or through the website, once we will put this online, maybe next week or so, you will be notified. You will see, get a notification that you can watch this online, and you will also find information on our next webinars. So thank you, everybody.